Good morning, friends. It's Saturday, and I'm back with Chapter 18 of my upcoming book, Campaign at Fort Stix. Now it's time to grab a snack, dim the lights, and let me take you into the mists of time with a story I call Extra Duty. Slowly trudging through the grass along the road, my cousins and I followed the setting sun home. All day long we followed the creek and explored many branches where other streams joined in their ever onward flow. Then, as the day began to fade, we found ourselves at a bridge several miles away and started the return walk. Now, walking along the road was much easier than the scrambling we did all day along the banks of the creeks. But it seemed to take a lot more effort to walk along the road going up and down the hills along the way home. It occurred to me that we had approached this day in reverse. If we had walked to the bridge in the morning and fished upstream back toward where we began, we would have only had a short walk from the creek to the barn at the end of the day. I made a mental note to suggest this if we ever decided to embark on this adventure again. The hill where I rode my skateboard the day before seemed a lot longer as we made our way up toward the house. But on we marched like weary soldiers returning from battle, until finally we turned into the driveway. As we returned from our fishing adventure, I saw there was an unfamiliar truck parked behind my uncle's car, and he was sitting on the front porch talking to a lady. I turned to Mark to ask about the visitor. "Who is that?" I asked. "That is the owner of the house, our landlady," Mark said. "She comes over sometimes to talk to Papa about work on the house and the hay in the barn. It's her hay that's stored here for her cows and horses." We waved politely as we walked by on our way to the back porch where we were greeted by my aunt. "You boys are a mess," she exclaimed. "Did you have fun and catch lots of fish?" "Yeah," Mark spoke up. "We must have caught and released over 100 chubs today. And Kevin hooked into a big fish this morning that pulled him into the water." Looking at me, my aunt smiled. "And so, how big was this fish, Kevin? What kind was it?" "I don't know," I responded. "It broke the line before I could reel it in." "Aw, that's too bad. Well, maybe next time." She pointed to the garage. "Okay. You boys put the fishing gear away and be sure to check your pockets and make sure there are no hooks or worms left in them. Then come in and get washed up for dinner." I followed Mark to the garage where we put everything back where we got it. We dumped the remaining worms back onto the mulch pile and checked our pockets to make sure nothing remained. I found it funny that my aunt had said to check our pockets as I remembered my mom finding snakes in mine. At dinner, the story of the fish pulling me into the water was told once again for my uncle's amusement. He responded that he knew there was a big catfish in the creek because he had hooked and lost it several times. He said he thought the fish had to be magical to have grown so big and still live in the shallow creek. We all shared a good laugh over this. After dinner, while my aunt and the younger cousins cleared the table, my uncle asked Mark and I if we wanted to work for the landlady, stacking hay in the barn for the next couple days. He said the work would be pretty hard, but she would be willing to pay us and would have a cooler of cold soda pop for our breaks. We both agreed that would be fine and were sent off to bed to rest for the coming day, as the first truckload would be arriving about 9 in the morning. I fell asleep as soon as I laid down that evening. The next morning, I was up in time to see my uncle depart for work and have breakfast before going out to the barn to wait for the landlady and the first load of hay. Mark and I climbed into the hayloft, and I noticed right off that someone had been there since we last were. The upper level of hay was lower, and the next level down was a little higher. Not only that, but someone had also moved the hay around and made a hay bale stairway up to the next level, just like I had thought to do. We were sitting on a bale by the opening looking out to watch for the truck when we heard a voice behind us. "Good morning, boys," the landlady said as she stepped onto the hay from the ladder. "We came by yesterday while you boys were fishing to restack the hay for today's loading. We could have used your help, but I understand how important fishing is, so no worries." We greeted her and watched as she came up and sat on the bale next to us. "The truck will be here any time now," she said. "When it gets here, I will take the bales from the conveyor and lay them behind me. I need you boys to stack the bales along the sides, starting at the bottom there." She pointed to the bottom of the hay stairs. "Be sure and pack them in as tight as you can, and then we will keep filling until we either run out of hay to stack or the bales are level across the top here." I looked at the area she pointed to and realized it was about 6 or 7 bales down to the next level. We were going to be moving a lot of hay. I heard the noise of a truck engine and saw a truck pull up next to the conveyor. The driver was an older man wearing coveralls and a straw hat. He threw us a wave as he got out and turned on the conveyor before climbing up onto the hay on the truck. He began to toss bales onto the conveyor, and we watched as the first one started to ride up to the window. The landlady stood in preparation to grab the first bale and reached into her back pocket. She held out 2 pairs of work gloves to us. "Here you go," she smiled. "The ropes on the hay can make the hands sore real fast without gloves." We put on the gloves and waited behind her for the first bales to be dropped from the conveyor. As the first one came over, she grabbed it by the strings and turned to toss it gently down the hay stairs. I liked that. I thought I was going to have to carry the bales down. I scooted down after it and picked it up to stack it off to the side. As I turned to get the next bale, I saw Mark coming out of the opening with a bale. I waited for him to pass and stepped into the opening in time to see a bale roll to my feet. I grabbed it and stacked it while Mark did the same. I did not count bales, but I did make a game out of fitting the bales into the stacks as tight as I could, and sometimes put the next bale on the next level up. Doing this, we were effectively stacking 2 layers at a time, and by the time we were close to the center, it was not as far to go to stack the next bale. Then the landlady was standing above us, looking down. "That looks real good, boys," she said with a smile. "Come on, let's go get a cold drink and wash the dust off while we wait for the truck to return with another load." We followed her out to the truck and sat on the tailgate as she got out cold bottles of soda pop for us. Sitting there in the morning sun, I realized it was already well into the morning and it would be lunchtime when we finished the next truck. I was surprised I was not tired as we moved a lot of hay. It was not as tough as I feared from my uncle's warning, and I was glad. The landlady finished her drink and laid across the front seat of her truck with her boots hanging out the open door. Occasionally, we could hear her talking to the truck driver on the CB radio as the tractor over on her other farm loaded the truck. Then she got up, led us back to the barn, and we waited for the truck to arrive again. We stacked 4 truckloads of hay into the barn over the course of the day, and by the time we were sent off to wash up for dinner, I was wore out. At the end, the hay was more than halfway up to the top loft where the conveyor came in, and I guessed it would only take 2 more trucks to finish the job. Maybe 3, but definitely no more. I was not even aware of eating dinner that night, nor showering or climbing into bed. I was up early the next morning as usual and made my way out to the barn after breakfast. Mark and I sat near the window at the top of the loft waiting for the landlady. Before long, we saw her truck pull in and watched as she made her way to the barn. Instead of climbing up to us, though, she hollered for us to come down. "One of my cows busted her stall this morning and disrupted the milking setup," she said, looking at each of us. "You boys up for a little cow wrangling?" I looked at Mark, and then before he could even answer, I blurted out, "Sure, let's go." She laughed and told us to climb in the bed of the truck because her cab was full of supplies, and it would take too long to move them. We did as instructed and held on as she turned the truck around and headed for one of her other farms. For me, this was a welcome surprise. I was used to riding in the bed of trucks, but did not think that would be happening while I was with my uncle. 10 minutes later, we pulled up next to a beautiful white barn with brown trim. It was painted more like a house than a barn, and on the front was painted a sign proclaiming the name of the milk farm with a picture of a black and white cow. The landlady let us in through an area that resembled an office to the clean and neat milking barn at the rear. At the center where we entered was a long concrete sidewalk all the way to the back. Along either side were gates to milking stalls for the cows, and most of them had a cow head poking out to eat the grain in the troughs before them. Except one. At the far end, a gate stood open, and the back door of the barn was open as well. Standing just outside was the rogue cow. "There she is, boys," the landlady said. "Let's go and see if we can get her back inside." As we walked toward the door at the end of the barn, the cow seemed to take a step further away from the door with each of ours, maintaining the distance until she reached the back of the corral where she stood looking at us with her head down. Her dark brown cow eyes dared us to approach. Mark and I moved off to either side as the landlady tried to walk directly to the cow. It was not having any of that, and ran to the right, only to be confronted with Mark holding his arms wide. The cow turned and came back to the left, past the landlady toward me. I had very little experience with big cows, and for a moment was worried she might just run me over. I looked her in the eye and held out my hand as if offering it to a dog to sniff. To my surprise, the cow stopped running and walked slowly to sniff my hand. It nuzzled my hand with its wet, leathery nose and then just stood there looking at me. I walked closer, rubbing my hand between its eyes like I used to do my horse, and the cow responded by tilting its head to get an ear scratch. "I'll be damned," the landlady said as she and Mark walked slowly toward me. "I think that cow likes you." I kept petting the cow as the landlady slipped up and hooked a lead to its halter. We walked the cow to the entrance of her milking stall and then closed the gate after she entered. The cow remained calm until the landlady reached for the milking tubes. Then she bellowed and began to try to bust out again. "I don't think she likes them tubes," I said. "She acts like maybe they hurt her or something." The landlady hung them back on the wall and then bent down to look at the cow's udder. She reached down and moved the teats around to look at them and then looked back at us. "Yeah, it looks like she has a rash and is sore," she said. "But she's full of milk. We need to drain her or she will be in more pain later." "If you have a bucket, we can milk her by hand," I suggested. A man at the county fair the year before had taught me how to milk a cow, and I knew it was fairly easy. "That would take too long," she said. "I have to hook up the rest of the cows and get the milk machine started, and we still have hay to stack." "Well, I could milk her while you get the rest going," I said with a grin. "You know how to milk a cow?" The landlady looked surprised. "Show me." I stepped through the rails to enter the stall and reached under the cow to grab two teats. Giving a bit of a push up to simulate a calf wanting to nurse, I gently squeezed down and squirted some milk to the floor. "That's pretty good for a youngster," she said as I stood up grinning. She turned to Mark and asked him to fetch a bucket and stool from up by the office. When he returned, she waited until I got in position and started milking the cow before going off to start the rest of them milking on the machine. Mark stood on the rails watching me, and I grinned while steadily draining the udder. After a few minutes, I changed teats to work the others, and before long was having difficulty getting any more milk from the cow. I stopped and reached up to feel her udder. Instead of feeling like a water balloon, it was now soft, and I knew she was done. The landlady came back as I finished and climbed back in the stall. She set the bucket of milk in the walkway and took a small tube of ointment from her pocket to rub onto the cow's teats. When she was done, we climbed from the stall, and she carried the milk to a large tank where she dumped it into the milk already swirling there from the other cows. "Well, thank you for the help, boys," she said, smiling. "Now, let's get back and finish stacking that hay. With little luck, we should be done by lunchtime." The first truckload of hay was waiting for us when we returned. It did not take long to get it unloaded, and the barn was getting full. We only had one more level before the lower level equaled the top. When the truck returned with the second load, we leveled the loft and stacked the rest of the sides in several tiers. As predicted, we were done in time for lunch. Emerging from the barn with the landlady, we stopped by her truck for a bottle of soda. It had been a pretty interesting day so far, and now that we were done stacking hay, we would be free to pursue our heart's desires for the afternoon. The landlady gave each of us a $5 bill for spending money and said she would give the rest to my uncle to hold for us. I have no idea how much that was and never found out, as my uncle gave my portion to my father when he took me home. We sat on the tailgate drinking our soda and admiring the money as she went to the front porch. It was then that I noticed my uncle's car was now in the driveway. He stepped onto the porch and talked with her a bit, and then she got in her truck and left, thanking us for a job well done. As she pulled out of the driveway, my uncle walked over to us, waving her goodbye. "I'm proud of you boys," he said, smiling. "She says you did a good job with the hay and were even a lot of help with the cows this morning. I have tomorrow off from work. How'd you boys like to go fishing at the pond with me?" I did not know where or what the pond was, but Mark seemed excited, so I quickly agreed that would be great. How could it not? It was fishing, and any day fishing was bound to be great in one way or another. "Good," he said. "Why don't you get washed up for lunch, and then this afternoon you can dig up a few dozen worms for tomorrow?" To me, this sounded like a great plan. I followed Mark to the back door where my aunt let us in to get ready for lunch. As we ate, Mark told me about the pond and the fish there. He said there were bass, bluegill, sunfish, crappie, and catfish. He said they were always good-sized fish, and Papa liked to bring home a mess of them for a fish fry. I could hardly contain my excitement. After lunch, we grabbed a couple of peanut cans and headed for the mulch pile. My uncle had spoken with my aunt while we ate, and she gave us permission to dig in the garden in the old radish patch to get worms. Apparently, Mark had not shared our secret for finding worms in the mulch pile. In no time, we had more than enough bait and put the cans in the garage with a nice covering of wet leaves to keep them lively until morning. Michael and Paul came out shortly after we finished gathering worms, and the four of us spent the rest of the afternoon eating cherries and running around the farm. I was very curious about the farm implements in the back of the yard by the big fields, and spent time examining different equipment as closely as possible. I was particularly interested in the combine, and wanted to see how it worked, but dared not climb up in the cab, as my cousins were quick to let me know it was off limits. There was no way I was going to risk getting into trouble on the eve of a fishing trip. I realized as I was dozing off that evening after dinner that I had not read from my magazines all week. I guessed it must be the country air, because even after spending a day running around like I did this day at home, I would usually read for at least an hour at home before I could fall asleep. Here, I barely had time to rest my head on the pillow before sleep grabbed me. Unlike my father, my uncle felt no inclination to get up before dawn to get ready to go fishing. We woke up at the usual time, had breakfast, and then went out to get the car loaded. I was brimming with anticipation at seeing a new fishing spot for the first time, and could hardly contain myself. There were moments I wanted to scream that we would miss the early bite, but restrained myself. It would not do to irritate my uncle. My sense of relief at finally departing was immense. Arriving at the pond, I was surprised. When I thought of a pond, it was usually fairly small, a couple acres at most. This pond was more like a lake. From where we parked, I could not see the opposite shore in any detail, as it was so far away. There were old trees and clumps of lily pads all over the pond, which I knew were excellent cover for fish. The water was colored light brown. On the shore near where we parked was a small boat with oars. We loaded the fishing poles and bait into the boat, and then my uncle paddled out into the pond. He seemed to know exactly where he wanted to fish and tied the boat to a tree limb a couple 100 feet from the bank. Without wasting any time, I baited up and dropped my worm down beside a tree that was sticking out of the water. We caught several large sunfish within the first few minutes, and then my uncle brought in a nice bass. I looked around at the water and noticed there was a patch of lily pads within casting distance. Rigging up a large nightcrawler, I cast it to the edge of the lily pads and kept tension on the line as it sank. Just as I was sure it was nearing the bottom, the line tightened and I was fighting a nice bass. At least, I thought it was a bass, because there was no way a sunfish or crappie would fight this hard. When I finally got it to the boat, I had a nice catfish of about 1.5 pounds. "That's a nice fish," my uncle said. "Go ahead and toss it back. Catfish are a lot of trouble to clean." I could not believe what I was hearing. Throw a good catfish back because they're trouble to clean? But catfish were one of my favorite fish to eat. Bass and sunfish are okay, but nothing beats a catfish for good eating in fresh water. I did not want to throw it back. "How about if I clean it?" I asked. "If you want to clean them, go ahead and keep them, but I would prefer bass and crappie," my uncle stated. I put the fish in the basket and continued fishing. I caught several more nice catfish that afternoon, as well as a bunch of sunfish and bass. My cousin was right. This pond had a lot of good-sized fish, and by the time we were finished fishing, we had more than enough for a large fish fry. I was looking forward to the catfish. Sure, they were a chore to clean, but they were worth it. I hope you enjoyed this look into the campaign at Fort Stix. That's all for now, but I'll be back again next week with another story, just for you. Until then, sleep well.